Dave and I got the upper deck enclosure put back together before leaving Whitehall, but the mast had to remain down so we could get the boat under a bridge by the last lock on the northbound portion of the trip. North of the lock, the waterways started out looking like a small river, but gradually widened out to the more grand dimensions of Lake Champlain, with its surrounding mountains, rocky shorelines, and increasingly deep water depths. We pulled into the Marina in the little town of Westport Monday afternoon. We were able to get the air conditioner fired up once again that evening, and we also got the mast stepped during our stay. Westport seemed a lot smaller and a lot financially healthier than Whitehall. I think Westport was more of a recreational-based town, where many of the town's inhabitants disappeared during the winter months. There were a few places to eat and a few places to pick up some grocery supplies, but not much of a selection in either category. We tried to make marina reservations in the city of Burlington, but it was too close to the 4th of July. All the slips were booked solid. We therefore headed up to an anchorage in Shelburne Bay on Tuesday afternoon. There were a few other boats anchored with us, and more boats anchored further to the north. It turned out to be an entirely acceptable location to hang out for the night, and we were able to rinse off in the nice, cool lake. The next day was the 4th of July. Dave and I repositioned the boat further north on the lake to an anchorage on the west side of Valcour Island. Several boats joined us at the anchorage during the day. There were hiking trails and campsites on the island, and the location had a strategic view of the fireworks westward towards the city of Plattsburgh. The sun was very hot that afternoon, but the lake water was cool. On Thursday, Dave took us on a tour north of Plattsburgh, but we returned to the big marina in Plattsburgh that afternoon. Dave and I walked around town a little, grabbed a burger at a local pub, and enjoyed a free outdoor concert after dinner, which was followed by a free outdoor thunderstorm after the concert. Although there are a few small stores in town to get basic grocery supplies, the main grocery stores seem to be out by the interstate. On Friday, Dave was busy, as usual, cleaning up the boat. His wife Isabel showed up later in the afternoon, and they shuttled me out to the grocery store. We said our goodbyes later back at the boat, and then Dave and Isabel returned to their home in Montreal. After a little more walking around the town of Plattsburgh, it was time to turn the boat around and start the long journey southward back towards Norfolk. After a nice walk around Plattsburgh on Saturday morning, I left the marina and headed south down the lake, passing through a big sailboat regatta along the way. The day's destination was Shelburne Bay, which is just south of the city of Burlington, Vermont. The anchorage was delightful, and I ended up loafing there for 3 nights. The weather was very cooperative, and I was able to sleep on deck all 3 nights. When I woke up Sunday morning, the deck was heavy with dew and covered with soggy insects. Fortunately, they were not biting bugs, but there sure were a lot of them. Since I would now be doing the Lake Champlain Canal locks by myself, I decided to make a couple custom lines for tying up inside the locks. I wanted my lines to have an ice splice at one end, so I did some splicing while I loafed in Shelburne Bay. An ice splice starts out with the 3 loose ends of the rope skewering the main body of the rope just below the eye. You then start threading the loose ends through the main body of the rope, with each loose end passing over the adjacent strand on the main body of the rope and then under the next strand. You do this for each of the 3 loose ends. As you repeat this process over and over, the splice slowly works its way up the rope, away from the eye. Eventually, the 3 loose ends become too short to go much further. You can either stop here, or you can choose to stagger the 3 loose ends. It's a personal preference sort of thing. After trimming the excess line from the 3 ends, I used to melt the ends with a Bic lighter, but I found that my soldering iron works even better. I like to whip the end of my lines with blue thread, mostly because it looks so cool. You can buy the whipping line at a marine supply store. As an example of how I whip the end of a rope, pretend my finger is the end of a rope that I want to wrap with whipping. You make a little loop a couple inches long with the whipping thread, then start winding the thread around your rope. You want to wind from the bitter end of the rope toward the little loop you just made. If you were doing this whipping for real, each turn would be right up against the previous turn. After a bunch of turns around the rope, you thread one end of your whipping line through the little loop you made. Now comes the really cool part. Using the other end of the whipping thread, you pull the little loop until it disappears under all the wraps. It is held there by friction. When finished, just trim off the loose ends of the whipping thread and you're done. As a side note, I only used my fancy-dancy lock lines once. They turned out to be too short, and I found I preferred a thicker diameter line. I ended up just using 3/4 inch dock lines for all the rest of the Lake Champlain locks on the return trip to Waterford, and that worked just fine. After a very enjoyable stay in Shelburne Bay, I pulled up the anchor Tuesday morning and motored the short distance to Burlington, Vermont. I stayed at the Burlington Community Boathouse Marina. It seemed to be a common practice for Lake Champlain marinas to require your credit card for a slip reservation, and they made no secret of the fact that your credit card would be charged whether or not you actually showed up. The Burlington Community Boathouse Marina actually has 2 docking areas, a north area here and a south area here, with a big-ass tour boat moored right in the middle here. When they told me to go to a slip on the south docks, I initially thought they meant one of the slips on the south side of the restaurant. It took a while before I realized they were talking about a whole different dock south of the big-ass tour boat. I really enjoyed my one-day stop in Burlington. It's an economically healthy college town city with lots of shops and restaurants within walking distance of the marina, although you should be prepared for an uphill walk from the waterfront. Burlington also has an unusually nice walking path that follows the lake shore north. After a Wednesday morning walk on Burlington's walking trail, I headed south down the lake to Button Bay, where I stayed for 2 nights. Button Bay is due east of the town of Westport, which Dave and I had visited earlier on the northbound portion of the trip. I enjoyed loafing on the boat in Button Bay, admiring the landscape by day and the Milky Way at night. On Friday morning, before I headed south toward Whitehall, I decided to drop the mast, which was not going to fit under the 17-foot bridge just south of the Whitehall Lock. Raising and lowering the mast is always sort of a scary activity, since the solid wood mast weighs a gazillion pounds and could do significant damage if it got out of control. Fortunately, everything went smoothly on Friday morning, though it was a bit challenging to control the ropes and control the video camera at the same time. Once the mast was horizontal, I had to lash it down to make sure it didn't move while the boat was bouncing around. Then all the mast lowering equipment had to be stowed away. This 2x4, which supports the upper deck stainless steel awning frame, also doubles as a fender board on the rare occasion when I have to tie up against pilings. The next step was to pull up the anchor. My anchor has 100 feet of anchor chain, but this isn't always long enough if the anchorage is more than a couple fathoms deep. For deeper anchorages, I keep 100 feet of anchor rode in the lazarette, which can be shackled onto the anchor chain. Since the shackle is too big to pass through the deck opening above the anchor locker, the shackle and anchor rope must be disconnected before bringing in the anchor chain. The final step in the process is to hook up the deck wash hose to clean up all the mud clinging to the anchor and the anchor chain. Notice how well the water drains off my bowsprit directly onto my shoe. As I motored south toward Whitehall, I had plenty of time to think about the lock. One of the reasons for doing this trip is that I wanted to find out how hard it was going to be to pass through canal locks single-handed. I had met one very experienced boater on Lake Champlain who told me I was a little crazy to try the lock solo, and he had some valid arguments to back up his opinion. But Dave had shown me over and over how to do it on the northbound portion of the trip, and I felt I just might be okay if I simply followed his example. I was pretty nervous when I entered the lock at Whitehall by myself for the first time. I was so nervous that I dropped my lock line not once, but twice. This lock was kind of different since they required southbound traffic to do a port side tie-up. I prefer to do a starboard side tie-up since my lower helm is on the starboard side of the boat. Despite all the challenges, locking through solo turned out to be very doable, especially if you could avoid dropping the tie-up line. The town of Whitehall was so happy that I did not destroy their lock, that they threw a free outdoor concert to celebrate. Or I suppose it was possible that the concert had been planned all along.
Could she woo? Could she coo? Has anybody seen my gal?